Welcome to the Brainbox Podcast. Brainbox is a program of Oklahoma Humanities, a nonprofit organization that brings the scholarship of the humanities disciplines to the general public. You can check out the other programs of Oklahoma Humanities at okhumanities.org. I'm your host, Chris Carroll, a program officer at Oklahoma Humanities. Brainbox is a podcast for your noggin. It's meant to challenge our on-air guests to make the humanities relevant to today and challenge listeners to use their Brainbox to make better sense of current events. We talk to experts in humanities fields like history, philosophy, literature, and ethics, who give informed views on the deeper historical and cultural contexts of world events. We encourage you to comment about what you've heard by going to our website, okhumanities.org/brainbox. You can leave comments and also find all of our previous episodes on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, YouTube, Spotify, and any other podcasting library. And you can email us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. In this episode, we'll be talking about Oklahoma history and Oklahoma's DNA with Dr. Bob Blackburn, the Executive Director of the Oklahoma Historical Society. Dr. Blackburn is a native Oklahoman who grew up in Edmond, graduated from Putnam City High School, and earned a Ph.D. in history from Oklahoma State University. Dr. Blackburn has written or co-authored 23 books about the history of Oklahoma, and he was instrumental in the creation of the Oklahoma History Center, the world-class history museum and research center located near the state capitol. Welcome, Dr. Blackburn.
Thank you, Chris. It's good to be with you today.
We're so honored to have you here. We're going to talk about Oklahoma DNA, kind of what makes Oklahoma, Oklahoma. So there's a question I've always wanted to ask someone like yourself. You have the biggest brain of Oklahoma history. So do you consider Oklahoma a western state, a southern state, southwestern, midwestern, a plains state, or something else entirely?
Well, to use a couple of hyphens in this, it's really south-southwest.
Okay.
Based on our southern history, because of the five civilized tribes, all brought southern culture with them. So culturally, we're more southern than you might think as far west as we are, because those tribes came from Georgia and Tennessee and Mississippi and Florida. And so when the elite of the five tribes came, they brought with them African-American slavery, plantation culture, riverboats, a southern way, and all five of the tribes fought with the South during the Civil War. So we are southern in terms of race. And because of settlement patterns, a large migration of African Americans from the Old South, starting in 1898 and peaking in 1920, would add to the racial DNA of the state. So without understanding race, you cannot understand Oklahoma politics. But we are Western. We were beyond the mid prairies. We're out on the high plains, cowboy culture, ranches, landlocked area. So we're really Western in a lot of ways, and we fit in with that. So I like to say south-southwest.
South-southwest. That's the best answer I've ever gotten. Thank you. I knew I was going to ask the right person this question.
Right, thank you.
I definitely want to talk about migration patterns more later, too, but I'm curious what you would say. What are some important aspects of what life was like in Oklahoma before statehood that affected, maybe continued to affect the way the state's identity and how it has evolved? It's the stories of how Oklahoma could have become an all-native state or an all-black state are so interesting. But what do you look back on from Oklahoma's pre-statehood history that still impacts Oklahoma today?
Well, you almost have to get to settlement patterns to really talk about that. And I like to use the metaphor of a patchwork quilt. And it's made from the crazy pieces. You know, if you're a quilt maker, you can do patterns where there's symmetry and order. Well, if you've read Sam Anderson's most recent book, Boomtown.
I'm going to ask you about that later, too.
Okay,
yeah.
well, good. Well, a little preview here.
Okay.
Well, his construct for the book is chaos versus order. Oklahoma's pre-territorial history is chaos in terms of settlement patterns. People come from all different parts of the world for different reasons, different backgrounds. So if you use this metaphor of a patchwork quilt with the crazy pieces, every little piece of the quilt represents another piece of cultural baggage we're bringing with us. So my grandparents came to Oklahoma in 1925, so not even before statehood, but they brought with them culture based in Arkansas, the South, South Carolina with the Confederate veterans, the immigrants who married into the family, first generation Irish, the Scots-Irish culture. So they brought that particular blend to Grady County. Well, if you take all parts of the state, you're bringing in people from New England. You're bringing people in from the Old South. You're bringing people in from the Mid-Atlantic, the Ohio River Valley, the farming frontier of Kansas and Nebraska. And they're all bringing their own skill sets with them, their own worldviews. Then you throw on top of that the American Indian population. And Oklahoma has had more Indians in our state than any other state. Now, that's not per capita, just total number of Indians. Oklahoma has more. And then even within the Indian community, you get the differences of almost a Neolithic Stone Age culture of the Comanches versus the Cherokees, who have had constitutional government since 1803, their own syllabary that Sequoyah developed, their own newspapers, a better school system than the surrounding states of Missouri and Arkansas at the time, and yet these warriors out on the high plains. So even differences within the Indian community. And so you get all of this diversity, all trying to move into one area that is created as a political entity. It's really not a cultural, a social, or an economic entity that we say is Oklahoma. It's what was left over after all these other frontiers were settled. And then the federal government says, we don't want more than one state out of all that mess, because it was a Republican Congress, Republican president at the time. They said, we don't want 4 Democratic senators from out there. We want 2. So we're going to combine all of these disparate pieces together, including the Panhandle, which had been no man's land, and say, we're going to squash this into a state. And so it was really an odd creation at the time. So that diversity helps explain so much in the rest of our history. So the DNA really has to start there with those settlement patterns. And then as you get into the politics and into the arts and all of the people in Oklahoma who have excelled in the different kinds of arts, a lot of this comes from that creativity that's created when people, different cultures come together, and suddenly you fuse old-time blues coming out of the Delta with jazz, with gospel, with country, with the Scots-Irish culture, and suddenly you get something brand new. So an artist is there, like, wow, I've never heard that before, become popular. And then that genre goes on and blends with something else. Well, we had more parts to ignite in Oklahoma. So that helps explain part of that combustion that we also call creativity in the state. And if you look at other things, even astronauts and soldiers, more soldiers coming from Oklahoma, and astronauts, pilots, test pilots. Well, out here on the frontier, we're not going to get it real easy. Life is going to be difficult in this because we're marginal for agriculture, we're marginal for ranching, we're marginal, all these different ways. And so people have to work a little harder, try something new. And with all the boom and bust cycles of our economic development, people are trying new things. And so you get this creativity in a Tom Stafford whose mother comes to the territory in a covered wagon, literally in a covered wagon. He looks up and looks at the stars, says, I'm going to go there someday, and goes into space. Flies around the moon with that little command module, picking the place Armstrong would eventually walk. This is a Weatherford, Oklahoma boy who's still with us, fortunately, today. But all that comes out of this diversity. So some people might complain, we've fought each other for years. It's the arid West against the humid East, and it's the Republican North against the Democrats of the South, and it's Oklahoma City and Tulsa, the Turnpike rivalry. Well, that may have held us back in some ways, but it's created this creativity and in contrast and vivid colors that can be expressed through the arts and through business. So the fact that, you get TG&Y and later Hobby Lobby, but even Walmart. Sam Walton from Kingfisher, Oklahoma. The money for that comes from his wife Helen, who grew up in Claremore with her banker dad, who bankrolled it. And then you get C.R. Anthony's store. So in the retail world, all these areas, that's part of our DNA being expressed through different means of life.
So when you hear people talk about diversity, the pros and cons of diversity, it never occurred to me that Oklahoma is such a great example of diversity leading toward creativity. Is that kind of a theme that you see throughout Oklahoma history then?
Very much. In fact, I always like to use, similar to Sam Anderson in Boomtown, I use challenge and opportunity as my construct. So most of the speeches I will give, how do we deal with challenges? We all have that in life. And then we also can see opportunities. Success in history is written by those who deal with the challenges successfully and seize the opportunities. So creating a recording studio, finding a job in the humanities like you, finding a way to write books like me. We dealt with these challenges. We developed the skill sets. We do it. We create. And in Oklahoma, where it's tough to really make a living and to get along, we tend to work a little harder. So when Okies go to L.A., they're going to be the hardest working musicians or the hardest working people in the movie industry. When they go to Nashville, they're going to be the hardest working musicians in the studio. Go to New York, working the hardest on the Christian Chenoweths. So you get this creativity from that tough background of a tough state to live in with extremes. But the challenges and opportunities, I think, can define our history.
You answered a question that I haven't even asked yet. That I talked to some loyal Brainbox listeners about questions they might have if they had a chance to sit down and talk to you. And one of them did ask me, why do so many great musicians come from Oklahoma? I moved here from Florida. I grew up near the Kennedy Space Center, and I was amazed at how many astronauts are from here. When I moved here, I saw the Thomas Stafford statue at Stars and Stripes Park in Oklahoma City. And but specifically the musicians that came from Oklahoma, I worked at a school that had like the first few months I lived in Oklahoma, I saw this poster every day that showed all the famous musicians from Oklahoma, and it blew my mind. Not just country, but jazz and blues legends and pop singers. That is the best answer I've ever heard about why so many great musicians have come from Oklahoma.
Well, thank you. Well, with that answer of the cultural mix of all of this is the mobility. Oklahoma's DNA really has a strong current of understanding mobility because we're an inland state. We have no ports. We have no easily navigable rivers. Of course, there were riverboats on both the Red and the Arkansas, but only seasonally. So to get from point A to point B, to make a free enterprise depends on delivering goods or services from point A to point B. Here, we have to work a little harder to get there. It takes a little longer. How do you shorten it? How do you be more efficient? And so with the mobility, we tend to pick up and go. We tend to accept others. If you'll talk to people at the national level, say, what do you think about Oklahoma? I used to think it was nuts. They'd say, well, you're so friendly. I said, wait a minute. People are friendly around the world. What's so special about that? But people come here and they say that. And
that was my first impression. Absolutely.
Yeah, people are friendly. Well, part of that is the mobility. Usually our people, our parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, have picked up from somewhere and come here, or we have come here. And that mobility is part of this frontier experience. But that mobility, too, of being able to accept others, to be able to move and share, then we hear different kinds of music, or we see different kinds of visual art, or different ways to express something in three-dimensional art, or we find a new way to record a sound and be able to be a creative. And so a recording engineer would get with an artist like a Leon Russell or a J.J. Cale and all of a sudden create something new. That's a sound on a new record at that time. And so looking for those opportunities to use this diversity, the ability to pick up and move and not be locked into doing it one way. I think Oklahomans tend to think, well, yeah, that may have worked for daddy or mom, but, I'm going to try something a little different. And so that creativity comes out in the arts as well as in the business sector. And to me, it just makes our history more interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about the migration patterns, are you interested in the different accents around the state of Oklahoma? How would you describe how they are different in different pockets of the state and how that evolved? Yeah,
and largely, those speech patterns have followed people from wherever they came from. For example, if you go to Mercurton County, where you get some of the deepest accents, That really is an old South. So you probably have to go to Mississippi, Alabama, parts of Georgia, perhaps, to be able to match those accents. And then the different Indian tribes have their own different intonations and their own patterns of speech. And so there's a difference between a Western tribal member, especially if they are fluent in their native language. They will take the patterns of their native language, and when they speak English, they're using English words in their native speech patterns. And so you can usually tell kind of what tribes and what parts of the state they come from. But by the time you get up to the Cherokee Outlet, it's a fairly flat Kansas, Midwestern accent. Tulsa will be different from Oklahoma City's accents. The accents in Oklahoma City generally come from the farm, much more of a rural background. Well, Tulsa, developing as the oil capital of the world, starting with the Glenpool Field in 1905, was not settled by people coming to farm land or to market the cattle and the cotton coming off of the land. They were coming to find oil. Well, they needed to come with this language that comes from Pennsylvania, New York, southern Ohio, on how to manufacture steel, how to come in and create drill bits. And so it's much more of an industrial culture coming in from the mid-Atlantic. And so the leaders there, Frank Keating is a good example of that. Frank Keating's dad was in the coal and minerals business in Pennsylvania before he came to Tulsa. Well, Frank Keating, if you listen to his accent, you can hear a little bit of the Okie in him because he grew up here, but I can still hear that mid-Atlantic. And so in Tulsa, you'll tend to hear those coming out of that old oil region. Here in Oklahoma, it's more farmers. So you get more Texas influence. So listen to a Garth Brooks, and you'll hear more of that southern accent in a Garth Brooks. Woody Guthrie, coming from the old South, the borderlands, you'll hear a different accent there. So you can hear it in our artists as well as traveling around the state. Now, mass media has tended to kind of knock off the highs and lows of the accents. So it's getting less and less every year, but it's still out there.
Well, the literal topic of one Oklahoman's DNA has been in the news recently with the controversy about Senator Elizabeth Warren's DNA test and national attention to the question of what constitutes Indian heritage. Her story seems not that uncommon, where Native heritage is part of family lore, but didn't include tribal enrollment necessarily. How has Native heritage and identity has it given a sense of pride to Oklahomans through the years? Have attitudes about this changed over the years?
Yes, and to get to the heart of that matter, that's been so misunderstood. And I thought that Chuck Hoskins Jr. in his comments was not completely understood by a lot of Oklahomans, but he should have been. To American Indians, being a member of the tribe is not about blood quantum. Blood quantum was never a big issue with the American Indians from their own perspective, because you could have an intermarried member in the family, and if they started acting Indian and looking with their worldview as an Indian, well, they were part of the tribe. And so blood quantum was not proof that you're Indian or not. So Elizabeth Warren, not understanding that, stepped into a mess when she claimed, because she had this, this small portion of Indian blood, that she's Indian. Well, to a Chuck Hoskins Jr., no, you don't understand the basics of being a Cherokee by saying that. Yes, you may have Indians in your background, but if you don't think like an Indian, if you don't see yourself as an Indian, and David Baird, a great historian in Oklahoma, wrote an essay for me at one time about what is it to be an Indian in Oklahoma, because of blood quantum. And he says it's the way you think of yourself. Do you think of yourself as part of a tribal group? Is that your clan? Is that your family? Is that what defines me as a person and the way I am? Blood quantum was imposed on the tribes by the federal government because the federal government for 200 years was trying to take land away from Indian tribes. And part of that assault was on tribal identity. And as many reformers would say at the time, kill the Indian to save the Indian, is that you still have a lot of Indians in Oklahoma But we want their land. We're going to force them to give up communal ownership, to take private ownership. We're going to destroy their identity as a tribe. We're going to make them good little Oklahomans, good little Americans, and try to extinguish this designation as tribes. Well, they couldn't do it. Tribal culture survived. And so you go from 1898 in the Curtis Act of abolishing the tribal governments, in effect, statehood, where there are no tribes, there are no tribal officials elected, no judges, no legislative branch, no executive, until the 1970s. So from the turn of the 20th century to the 1970s, no formal tribal government, but there is tribal identity. It's surviving in those families. By Lake Canton, there are families in the hollows in the Boston Mountains. There are families down in Chickasaw Nation who still they'll see themselves as Chickasaw or Cherokee or Cheyenne. And once federal government says you can organize your governments again, which they did in the 1970s, then you have constitutional law, you have executive, legislative, judicial branches that can provide services and be a vehicle for a community. Government is really nothing but us saying we are a corporate body. You know, we're the people of Oklahoma. We're the people of the United States. Government are our officers and the people who will maintain order and regulate our lives to make us healthy, safe, prosperous, and all that. That's what the tribal governments did. The Indians were still there. The Cherokees were still the Cherokees, even without a constitution. Constitution gives them a way to express themselves, to serve themselves. And today, not only with sovereignty and self-rule, but self-tribal, self-determination through tribal enterprise. People may resent gaming and say, why don't we all get the benefits of gaming? Well, after 200 years, under assault from the federal and state government allowed exploitation of Indian resources. It was a national scandal. Still, really, I think, one of those points of Oklahoma history we cannot be proud of. But yet they survived until the 70s and 80s. And then the gaming was part of tribal enterprise to give a sovereign people the means to fund their own programs the Cherokee way, the Potawatomi way, the Cheyenne way, the Comanche way, because each is going to look in their worldview differently. And so when Elizabeth Warren stepped into that issue, she didn't really understand. She thought she was Cherokee because she had some blood. No, she has to think Cherokee. She has to be part of the community and say, I am one of you. So their voting rights, their blood quantum, but it still comes back to who am I? Am I Cherokee? And so that's created a lot of resentment over the years. Sorry, I probably got off into a rabbit hole there on that.
No, I'm so glad you answered that. Man, I have another question from a listener. We often see Oklahoma listed at or near the top of lists of unflattering national statistics, especially criminal justice statistics, let's say, about incarceration rates. Are there aspects of Oklahoma's identity or our history that help explain this? Is this in our DNA? Very
much so. In fact, I'm doing a story with a reporter Thursday on incarceration, criminal justice in Oklahoma. It's a big issue right now around the state. We tend to lock people up for a long time. Part of that goes back to our evangelical Christian heritage. Most of the Oklahomans coming here would have been evangelicals, generally Baptist, Methodist, Church of Christ. Catholics would have been a small minority. Other religions would have been just barely showing up on the screen. But that evangelical Christianity is there. Mix that with a southern state with a heritage of racism, of segregation, of denial of civil liberties, going all the way back to slavery was a part of Oklahoma heritage for far too many years. You go back, add the racism to the evangelical, and then what comes out of this DNA is we put our women on a pedestal. We're going to defend their honor. You know, we'll fight for our women. But then we expect more. When they make a mistake, we punish them more. When an African American commits the same crime as a white man, he is going to be judged not as a criminal who committed a crime, but as an African American. And we can prove through our records that for the same crimes, the same rates of repeat offenses, A white man might get 24 months for one crime. An African-American male might get 3 years in prison. A woman will get 4 years in prison, white or black. And so this attitude of we don't tolerate people falling off their perches, and we don't tolerate people we expect to be second-class citizens, or at least many generations expected that. Watching them now, and it's to in our DNA, it's still not a level playing field. Women are on a different level. And then for so many years with that glass ceiling, no, stay in the family. You still hear that out of some churches. Women have their place. They should be at home. Males should be the dominant gender. And so this is all part of our frontier heritage. And because of the fact that many people who came to Oklahoma in the settlement patterns were looking for a second chance, usually means they failed somewhere else. Like my granddad, he was starving out as a sharecropper in Arkansas. Came out here, found a job laying pipeline for Oklahoma Natural Gas. So first 4 kids raised, the sharecroppers economy of southern Arkansas, barely finished high school. Last 4 kids all had college degrees. But people were coming here with very little in terms of material. And so you get cycles of poverty. Some people could work their ways out of poverty, like my granddad, lucky enough to get a job laying pipeline for Oklahoma Natural Gas. A white man who, was part of the dominant culture, had those opportunities. There were other families coming who did not have the same opportunities to get out of those cycles of poverty. And then when you throw in industrialization and urbanization, in certain families, the cycle of poverty can't be broken or has not been broken. And so you get people out of those cultures making mistakes in life. And the dominant culture saying, survival of the fittest. They're not among the fit. We have to put them away for life and allow the strongest, the smartest, the fastest to survive, as if those were white males as the strongest who should survive and prosper. And you get that dominant culture that has, different ways of looking at criminal justice and who do we punish? Who do we give the opportunities to? So the story of civil rights in the state is a story of pushing back on that dominant white culture and saying, no, we are also human beings. Just because of the pigment of our skin does not mean we should be second-class citizens and be treated differently from everyone else. We need access to the same opportunities. But after 150 years of not granting those opportunities, people say, well, why haven't we broken that cycle of poverty in certain parts of our communities? Well, they don't have the advantage of a couple of 100 years of working their way out and finding these opportunities. So we need to help. Affirmative action, equal opportunity. We need to make sure that we're providing those opportunities. The same with women. You have hundreds of years of them being told, no, stay at home. We don't want you in business. You can be a teacher or a secretary. But if you get married as a teacher, you're going to be fired, which was very common until the 1940s and 50s. And so now we've got to create additional opportunities because of that traditional lack of opportunities. So this whole story, and then we ask our government, whether it's city, county, state, federal, to provide the means for balancing that. And that's where we have differences of opinion. Some people say, no, survival of the fittest. With the libertarian point of view of government, least government is the best government. Let's let it take its toll. But then others will say, no, for 200 years, starting with slavery and denial of civil liberties, we've got a lot of ground to catch up on. And after hundreds of years of telling women that their place in life is going to be limited, that we can tell them what to do in their lives, tell them what they're going to do with their bodies, then you get pushback and you get these contrasts in our culture. And we ask our government to solve those problems. So you're going to have differences of opinion. You're going to have polarization on different issues coming from different parts of the state. And that's what we really need to understand about our DNA and about our culture to be able to be part of that conversation. That we're asking our state representatives, our congressmen, our judges, the people at the city and the state, we recently have had a new trend with city council races.
Yeah.
Here we're asking 20-year-olds to make decisions for us as a community based on all of this complex history. Hopefully they're quick learners. But obviously they're going to be willing to try new things, and maybe that's the way to go.
Speaking of new things in Oklahoma and cultural changes, in a relatively short period of time, we've voted to reform laws regulating the sale of alcohol and medicinal marijuana. Given the history of Oklahoma's attitudes about these substances, were you surprised by these developments? Do they seem pretty rapid?
Well, they do seem rapid, but as a historian, I look at it the long view, it's a progression. It's just another step. And that's been happening as Oklahoma became an urban state, because the evangelical Christian community DNA was strongest at the local level in small communities where grandma and granddad were watching you. So, and aunt and uncles were, on the next quarter section of land, and cousins would be in town. And if you violated the community's standards, well, mama's going to hear about it. Daddy's going to hear about it. Well, you get into an urban situation, working in the oil patch in Tulsa with a bunch of money in your pocket and a pint of whiskey in your coat, and good time on Saturday night is getting into a fight. Well, it creates a different culture. So as urban Oklahoma has grown, and that's been going on since 1898, even during the golden age of farming, cities were growing faster. Oklahoma City, fastest growing city in the nation between 1900 and 1910, went from 10,000 people to 64,000 people in one 10-year. If we did that again, we'd be a town of 6 million people in the next 10 years. And that's how quickly we were growing. Tulsa, pretty much the same thing. So the urban environment would get to the point where we want our alcohol. So that's where the move for repeal of prohibition in 1959 really starts in the urban areas. And that's why if you would go to a lot of the small towns around Oklahoma in the 1960s, there would be more parking behind the liquor stores because people didn't want the people at the church seeing them going to buy liquor. So you pull behind the liquor store and get your pint or your quart, and you go home and you do it behind closed curtains. You don't do it downtown. You don't do it openly at the local restaurant. Well, the drive for liquor by the drink starts with the Oklahoma City Chamber of Commerce in the 1980s. We did not have legal liquor by the drink. We had liquor by the wink. It was happening. It just wasn't legal. And then marijuana. Marijuana has been in Oklahoma since the 19th century. When I was in college in the 1960s, it was everywhere. Illegal, of course. And so the urbanization, the change, I think, has contributed to a change of those attitudes. And those of us who have lived a long time, I'm now 67, I look at the changes in our culture and I think, well, where'd that come from? But generally, if you look closely, you're going to find something that'll lead back to that DNA. It's still got an impact on us, but times will change. And some people embrace change. Others think, no, we want it the way it was in 1950. Make Oklahoma great again kind of attitude. Well, no, we don't want to go back to Oklahoma in the 1950s. If you really spell it out to what it would have been like then, women, African Americans, American Indians, no, we don't want to go back to the 1950s. And so progress is here. It's a reality. And how we deal with the progress, how do our laws reflect that? How do we make sure that people are inclusive, not just in the laws, but in their hearts and their minds? It all comes back to education, learning to live together, learning to understand what's going on. And so a lot of this is grounded in a better understanding of history.
I know you're an aficionado of Oklahoma's political history, and one of our listeners really wanted me to ask you about just how our DNA affects Oklahoma's DNA affects Oklahoma's political culture. There's no shortage of flamboyant and controversial characters throughout the history of Oklahoma's politics. So how has Oklahoma's DNA manifested itself through our government, our state and local governments?
Well, it's after President Obama was elected, I had probably 50 requests for speeches that you explain this to us, at what's happening here, and especially in the elections and his midterm and at the end of his first term. It was a transition point. Oklahoma, originally very southern state, very democratic. And to understand that, you have to trace the Democratic Party back to the 1850s, when the Democratic Party was largely a Southern party. And so it was the Republicans then would have been the party of Abraham Lincoln and the party of Jefferson Davis, the Democrats. And so coming out of the Reconstruction, the Democratic Party was resisting the Republican, as they would have thought about it from the South, the invasion, the Reconstruction occupying troops. And federal troops would stay in the South until 1876. So the Democratic Party was pushing back on that, was in favor of segregation, Jim Crow, of another form of slavery. It wasn't called slavery, but it was tenant farming, sharecropping. And so you get the the Democrats embedded in the South and in the cities, with the Irish coming over, the Italians. They want their beer on Sundays. They want their alcohol that they've grown. They want to be able to grow their vineyards and have their wine as they've done in their cultures. Well, the evangelicals would have been siding in the Midwest with the Republican Party. And so fast forward to the 20th century, urban Oklahoma was largely Republican, and it's been split between Republican Democrats since the very beginning, with the Republican Northwest coming in from the Midwest, with that Republican tradition coming out of Ohio and Illinois, going all the way back to the New England states, comes into Oklahoma. So the Cherokee Outlet really settled by these Midwesterners. That's the cornerstone of the Republican Party in rural Oklahoma. Then you get the Republicans largely in Tulsa with the industrial class, the Republicans in Oklahoma City, against the rest of the state. That's largely Democratic and Southern. And although we were a one-party state, it was barely a one-party state for the first 80 years of state history. Is that if you go back and look for the race for governor, yes, the Democrats are winning, but they're never winning by much. And it only took an agricultural, rural farmer who was a Marine veteran who would put on the farm tractor hat running against the Democrat who was a city boy running a newspaper and a developer of houses for him to win for the Republicans, and that was Henry Bellman in 1962. He reversed the roles, even though he still called himself a Republican. He picked up enough votes in rural Oklahoma to go with the traditional Republican votes to be elected against Bill Atkinson. And then Dewey Bartlett followed on his coattails as an oil man from Tulsa as well. Well, it started changing in the 20-teens. Well, now rural Oklahoma is as red as you can get, but Oklahoma City and Tulsa are becoming more Democratic. It's all flip-flopped in the old traditions. And so electing a Democrat from Oklahoma County to Congress, that had not happened for a long time. And so things are changing with demographics. And politically, we see that, Trump land is rural Oklahoma now. There are going to be elements of it in Oklahoma City and Tulsa, as there's always been differences. But largely, you're going to have those polarized politics at the state capitol. And our politics has always been best understood, in my opinion, if you look at it not as Republican versus Democrat, but it's rural versus urban. It's been that way since the very beginning. So you'd have a Charles Haskell, an urban developer out of Muskogee, against a Alfalfa Bill Murray, a rural guy out of Tishomingo. They got together and found enough in common to dominate the Constitutional Convention. Murray would become the first Speaker of the House of Representatives and make a lot of the laws that we've lived under since. And then Charles Haskell, the first governor. A railroad promoter, an urban developer, versus this Jeffersonian agrarian fellow who says, no, society is best when we don't have big business, when we don't look to centralized government, where best government is local. Yeah, those county commissioners might be crooked, but they're our crooks kind of attitude. And that's what, in Alfalfa Bill, remained that way until his death, well after World War II. Never gave up on that rural Jeffersonian. But in Haskell, so even in the beginning, you have to understand the rural, urban conflict to understand Oklahoma politics, whether it's prohibition and repeal and liquor by the drink, parimutuel horse racing, cockfighting, criminal justice, public safety. It was really an urban governor that created the Highway Patrol in 1937 because law enforcement at that time was all local. It was county sheriffs, city police. They didn't want to give up their power to a state. Why would we give up our control to Oklahoma City? That's like people say, why are we going to give up our control for Washington, D.C.? We don't want that stimulus money. We don't want those federal programs. We don't want that Medicare or that Medicaid money. It's the same thing repeated over and over again. If Alfalfa Bill Murray had been alive in 2012, he would have been the poster child of the Tea Party. The Tea Party is Alfalfa Bill Murray. There's a new book out, in fact, a very good book on Alfalfa Bill. I'd recommend to readers who are trying to understand this, the enigma of Alfalfa Bill. Progressive in some ways, but then one of the poster child racist, libertarians, Jeffersonian Democrats of all time. But that's our splits usually can be defined somewhat urban-rural. And then you throw in religion, you throw in that cultural baggage, you throw in race, and you get this mixture that is Oklahoma politics.
Well, speaking of rural and urban, our biggest urban center, Oklahoma City, and we've talked about the book Boomtown by Sam Anderson. What was your assessment of that book? It's gotten so much attention nationwide, and it's such a fun read. Was there anything left out or misrepresented in the book that bothers you? Or?
Oh, no, not at all. I love the book.
Oh, great.
Sam and I were friends.
Yeah.
And as he says in the preface, I was one of his informants. He had a bunch of them. He made a lot of friends. He's just a gregarious guy and one of the best writers that I've ever known. The book has a great construct with chaos versus order. And I think people need to understand it's not a history. It's a portrait of a city. Because he takes, the chaos of the land run and in trying to find order out of that. So he'll find someone like an Angelo Scott, who's this Midwesterner who comes in, wait a minute, guys, we can't kill each other over land. Let's have a committee of 14. Let's survey the city. Let's have this provisional government so we can coexist without killing each other. And so out of that chaos comes this urge for order. Then you take a Gary England. It's one of his main characters in the book. I thought that was very creative.
Oh, yeah.
And the chaos of our weather. We can have some of the most beautiful weather in the world on certain days when you're just alive and you can smell the air and just that blue sky and you're part of nature. But then you can have days where it wants to kill you. And so Gary England there, living in this world of order, of trying to predict. There's no greater expression of order than prediction. You're predicting something, then you measure it, and then you're this engineer, sense of order. But then you've got this chaotic weather conditions where it's all colliding here in the southern plains. And it made Gary England a national hero, a star of Twister the movie. And so you take these stories of Wayne Coyne as this chaotic guy, as this bundle of energy and creativity that sees no boundaries. Well, we want to paint the streets? Yeah, let's go. Let's get the paints on the back of the truck, and all 5 of us are going to do our thing. It's chaotic.
That's the way Russell Westbrook plays basketball, too.
Well, and that's the way he starts, with the beard and Russell Westbrook and Kevin Durant, this different way. So using the thunder as one of the metaphors. It's a wonderful book. I would highly recommend it.
The book's stories about, say, Clara Luper's sit-in protests, I've heard people talk about, I've heard people say about the book, why didn't I learn about that in my history class? And at Oklahoma Humanities, we've sponsored several programs highlighting the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. And people have also said, why wasn't I taught this in school? What are some ways that you wish Oklahoma history was taught differently in schools? Well,
I think we try to do too much in our schools. We try to go all the way from territorial days, Indian removal, to present day. It's way too much. And I think young people have a hard time really comprehending chronology, that something happens here and you can see the consequences of it later. I like teaching through biography. I still think that's the best way. So I gave a speech last week at OSU on the all-black towns of Oklahoma. And so in doing that, I took one family, the Franklin family. Started off with the slave of the Chickasaw Nation. Earns his own freedom before the Civil War, marries a woman who is 3/4 African American, 1/4 Choctaw. And then he creates a farm, fights for his freedom, literally, with the first Kansas Color Regiment Civil War, has a ranch and raises a son who's one kid is the smart one, wants to go to college. He has the resources, have broken the poverty the cycle of poverty and the legacy of slavery to do well enough to send his kid to Atlanta to go to school, becomes an attorney, moves to the all-black town of Renniesville where he's trying to find social justice, has a young son born in 1919 named John Hope Franklin, who would then be raised in Tulsa with the scars of the Tulsa Race Massacre. John gets a scholarship to Harvard, the first Ph.D. in history from Harvard. He writes a book in the 1950s called From Slavery to Freedom that a Bob Blackburn has in college that opens my eyes to the impact of racism on American culture. That allows me to spend 40 years trying to say, no, we need to be more inclusive. We can't push people aside. And so teaching that through that one family, the Franklins, I just took you on that story from slavery to what we're doing with our programs today around the state. I can teach a lot by using biography. So to me, biography is the key. I think we need to lean on that more and take some of the teaching outcomes that are in the state standards, and they're good. Department of Education does a good job. But to expect a teacher, especially a coach, who's really, his focus is going to be on winning that next game. If he doesn't win the next game, he's not going to have a job. Secondary is, let's make sure these kids learn something before they get out of my class. It's almost an impossible task. And so Humanities Foundation Council. I'm sorry. I'm an old-fashioned...
We used to be the council. Now we're just Oklahoma Humanities.
Oklahoma Humanities. Not even... You don't use a foundation word, so the branding there has changed.
Yes.
I'm old enough to remember it the old way. But Oklahoma Humanities is out there trying to package learning different ways, because people learn different ways. We can't expect a cookie-cutter approach to work. Historical Society is looking for ways to teach. Sam Noble Museum, how do you teach natural history? The Science Museum, how do you teach technology? We can all teach different ways. And when people say, why do we need all these cultural organizations such as Oklahoma Humanities? We say, we've got to have it. We have to have an educated population. If we're going to get representatives and senators and council people and commissioners who represent us, who will make the right decisions, we have to make the right decisions. And history shows you make the right decisions when you're best informed. If you've got a set of knowledge that allows you to assess the facts with critical thinking, come up with your own conclusions, and then express yourself at the ballot box, then we will have better representation. So if people complain about their government, they need to look at themselves and their neighbors, half of whom don't vote. And then I don't know what percentage of others do vote who really don't understand the issues. They're just voting because someone said, build a wall or whatever it might be that seems to ring to them without the background. So we have got to be pushing out with different ways to learn and give people different options. This podcast is a good example. You've adopted a new technology to share the humanities with the public. It's innovation that's looking for opportunities. It's getting beyond the old challenges of how do we get the voice of Oklahoma Humanities to the greatest number of people. Well, you found a way. That's success. That's history. We've all got to do that in our own line of business. How do I teach history better? How does that teacher do it a little better? How does the business person adapt to changes and build, loves country stores and travel stops? How do they at Sonic learn how to sell more hamburgers and drinks? We've all got those challenges. Success comes from learning how to seize those opportunities.
I wish we had another hour with you, Dr. Blackburn, but I do want to ask, this might be a difficult question for a historian, but I'm curious, thinking about Oklahoma's DNA, what aspects of it do you think will continue to endure in the next century? How do you see Oklahoma changing in the future?
I think that we still have that DNA of largely an agricultural community. I'm third generation city boy. My mom and dad, neither one of them, plowed a furrow behind a mule. My grandparents did. But I still feel that connection to the land. I'm still willing to work hard. I still want to be up early in the day. I feel like, it's my obligation. If I'm going to get paid 8 hours, I better give them 10 hours. Let's overdo it. I think that hard-working spirit still survives in Oklahoma. I think we're becoming more inclusive, and I think that we are overcoming our DNA on wanting to separate our community. I think we're becoming more inclusive, so we're dealing with that. And to me, to overcome the legacy of racism and gender bias, it requires education. Every generation has to move forward. And I'm proud to say that my son now lives in a multicultural community. I raised him in an inner city neighborhood in Oklahoma City. I wanted him to go to public schools. I wanted him to have friends from all different sides of the track, socioeconomic, racial backgrounds. He has that, and so his generation is expressing that much better than my generation did. So I see the progress of dealing with the strengths of our DNA in terms of the hard work and the friendliness and the mobility. We're ready to say, hey, yeah, we failed there, but we're going to go over here and try again and pick up the pieces. And so you see it in the food culture. You see it in entertainment. You see it in the business community. Astronauts, Miss Americas, whatever it might be. That DNA is there. And my son did well as a photographer in San Diego because he worked harder than most of those California kids. They've had it pretty easy for several generations. Here comes this crazy kid from Oklahoma who's willing to work 7 days a week, any time of the day or night. And he's friendly. People like him. And so in Denver, it's working there. And so you get these qualities that help us. And then we've got to push back, though, on those parts of our DNA that tell us, nah, we shouldn't give them an opportunity. They don't deserve it. Survival of the fittest. Well, it's not that simple. So I think the DNA is there, and it's an asset and a liability at times. But it's kind of like Sam Anderson's book, Chaos and Order. It's that contrast. And if you'll think about entertainment, movies, books, anything else, they all have a construct of dramatic tension, is what I call it. There's a good guy and a bad guy. There's going to be chaos, the world is coming to an end, and here's someone trying to survive. This dramatic tension drives entertainment. That's why we read and we watch and we listen. Dramatic tension. Well, society is that same way. And the DNA creates that dramatic tension. It's one reason I'm fascinated by Oklahoma history. And the more I learn, the more I understand I don't know. And so, I keep yearning. I've got to know more. And I can't help but interview people about their own backgrounds. Because if everyone can have that attitude, we need to learn more. We need to understand we don't know everything. Let's not trust our gut feeling, as some of our leaders are saying, is that, no, our decisions need to be based on knowledge and understanding, not on this intuition and a feeling that something should be a certain way. Generally, you're going to fall back on stereotypes and old methods that just didn't work before. So I'm very hopeful about our future. I think Oklahoma is a great state, and I think it'll be better for our grandchildren than it was for us. And I think we're living in a time that was better for us than it was for our grandparents. So I see this progression, and I'm hopeful.
What is the next thing that you want to study about Oklahoma? What's something that you feel like you don't know enough about that you want to pursue?
Oh, gosh, I always have a couple of books going. One that I want to pursue, oddly enough, is more of a history of rodeo and cow culture. Oh. Its evolution from the Wild West shows, because we now have Will Rogers Memorial under our umbrella at the Oklahoma Historical Society, so I've become a Will Rogers nut. In fact, I'm reading another book on his political commentary right now. Oh,
we're doing an episode about that pretty soon, actually.
Very good. Yeah. Well, Will is this, to me, he is an American icon. What he expressed, the attitudes. If you understand Will Rogers, you understand the DNA of Oklahoma. Multicultural, a Southerner trying to adapt to a new world, trying new things, a creative kind of guy, this dramatic tension. Will Rogers is fascinating. Well, I want to go from the Will Rogers real Cherokee cowboy and his dad Clem, who established a more than 10,000-acre ranch, all the way through the story of the Wild West shows, and Will was there. I want to take it to the early cowboy movies that were made as early as 1904 in Oklahoma. I want to take that through the end of the Wild West shows, the rise of the roundup clubs, because all these former cowboys and kids are moving to towns and cities, but they still love that cowboy culture. So they find a way to still play with the horses and the ropes and the steers and the buck and broncs, to today's fascination with professional bull riding. And there are different stories in there that I want to trace and how that's changed over the last 100 years.
Will you come back and talk about that on another episode?
I will.
Well, I'd love to talk about that.
I may be coming back in a wheelchair when I get that finished, but this looks handicap accessible. So
yeah, okay.
I'll work my way in.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Blackburn. Is there anything you want to mention about what's going on at the History Center these days?
Oh, we have so many programs, and I want people to know that, like, we brought in young Martha Washington from Colonial Williamsburg last week. People there say it was fabulous, one of the best we've had. We do those about every 4 months. We have Kilgan concerts with a Kilgan organ that E.K. Gaylord bought in 1937 for WKY radio. We spent $1 million restoring it. We have these creative programs. So much is going on. The new exhibit on Oklahomans and the war in Vietnam. You know, I come from that generation where our worldview was affected by the war in Vietnam. It's part of our DNA. I finally found a way to deal with that issue for those who served, those who didn't. But in a creative way. We have a new exhibit on the 75th anniversary of the stage play in Oklahoma. But we have things happening around the state, and I want to encourage people to get out, see Oklahoma, understand our history, and become better citizens.
Well, we'll put some information about the History Center on. We do an individual web page for each episode, so we'll make sure this episode has some extra information about that. And thank you again for being here. It's a great discussion. And we encourage you to comment about what you've heard on the BrainBox podcast. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the okhumanities.org/BrainBox website, and on social media by using the hashtag BrainBoxOK. Please give us a rating, and you can also email comments and ideas for future episodes to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Thank you to Blacken Studios. You can find out more about Blacken Studios at blackenstudio.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our theme music was composed by Lauren Nixon. This program is funded by Oklahoma Humanities. Any views expressed in the podcast do not necessarily represent those of Oklahoma Humanities. And this has been BrainBox, a podcast for your noggin.